back with chapter 14 of Exodus. This is the famous section of the text where God splits the Red Sea so that Israel can get through and Egypt cannot. I found some interesting things in this chapter this week, which I had no idea were there, which is very interesting because this is like such a famous story. But there's some details in the story that I just had never heard before. So I'm going to share a couple of them with you. And then we're going to go ahead and work through a couple of observations, a couple of questions that I brought from the observations that I had from studying the text this past week. So some of the details that I didn't know, just to give you guys a quick background for those of you who aren't familiar, at this point of the story, Israel has been freed from Egypt. Israel has been brought out of Egypt. Egypt was done with God's consequences for their disobedience, with Pharaoh's disobedience. God had sent a number of situations and scenarios to the people of Egypt and to Pharaoh to discipline them for not letting his people go. By the time they get around to the last disciplinary action, Egypt says, you know what, guys, go ahead. You guys can go, and here's all of the goods that we have to take with you so that you stay good and gone. Shortly after that, Egypt changes their mind. God starts the chapter 14 with telling Moses and the Israelites that Egypt is actually going to be coming their way, that they changed their minds, that they want to take them back into captivity. What's interesting about this is that the people of Egypt have been through a long process of disobedience and a long process of consequences as a result of that disobedience. Granted, it's the disobedience of the Pharaoh directly that has affected all of his people, but it even gets to the point at the end of the plagues that the people of Egypt say to the people of Israel, go, get out. Like, they kick them out. The Egyptians are, I think the word that they use is hasty with kicking the Israelites out. So they want them gone. Pharaoh wants them gone. Everybody wants them gone. In a very short period of time, they decide they don't want them gone, that they want them back. And so what they do is they rush after the Israelites, who have now been in the wilderness for a little while, making their way over to where God would have them be. And they come up to the Red Sea. So the Israelites are at the Red Sea, and they turn around and they see the Egyptians behind them. And the way that the text is written, it almost, in my mind, this is the visual that I have in my mind, is that you have the Red Sea right here, which is actually the Reed Sea, which is a conversation for another time, but it's translated red. Over time, it's been translated red, but it's actually supposed to be the Reed Sea. So you have the Reed Sea right here. Then you have the Israelites right next to the sea. Then you have, I imagine, some kind of a slope where you can see the Egyptians, because the text says something like the Egyptians were looking down on Israel. And I think that that was a literal looking down on. In my mind, it is. So you have the Egypts up here looking down on Israel, and Israel looking up at Egypt going, oh my gosh, what is going on here? Where did you lead us, Moses? What is going on? Israel cries out to God and says, you have to help us. And Moses, rather than turning to God, this is a detail that I didn't know before, rather than turning to God as his chosen leader of his chosen people, Moses responds immediately to Israel crying out and accusing him of being a bad leader. Moses turns around, and while he has good intentions, and while I think there is truth to what Moses says about being still, which I'll get to in a minute, he still doesn't turn and ask God. And what Moses says and what God says are two totally different things. Moses literally says, don't have fear, be still. God's direct message right after that in the text is go forward. So where Moses is saying, stay still, God is saying, no, I need you to go forward. I want you to go forward. So it's just interesting that sometimes as leaders, as spiritual leaders, we find it necessary to give people an immediate reassurance of faith in God, and to be still and know that the God is Lord, and know that God has our back, but be still and wait, when actually God would have us go. So that's a very interesting a way to see how the leadership, how Moses' leadership has caused some kind of a contrast between what God would say and what Moses said. I just thought that was a very interesting detail. Now, what Moses did know, or maybe didn't know, is that because the text is vague in this area, and the scholars that they don't really have any idea either. So what happens next is they don't have any idea whether or not Moses knew to be still was because what happens next is, so you have Egypt up here on the mountain in my mind, looking down on Israel in the text, and you have this space in between, and then you have Israel again bumped up right in that right next to the water. So you have, what happens is God tells Moses to stretch his hand over the sea, and to stretch his hand over the sea, that God's going to part the sea. After that, God sends, the angel of God comes down on a cloud, and he settles in between Israel and Egypt. So there's a cloud in between them. And nowhere in the text does it say that Israel knows that this is the angel of God. So now you're an Israelite and you're standing on the edge of the water. You're extremely uncomfortable. You don't know where you're supposed to go, where you're heading, what this leader has done to you, where you're supposed to end up in this situation. As far as you can tell, you're going to be put back into captivity or you're going to die. And here comes this cloud. So now you can't even see your enemy. You can't even see the people who want to come after you. You can't see your captives. Your captors. You can't see them. So now you're in, and it's the middle of the night, the text says that this is all happening at night. So this is a pretty dark, pretty scary, pretty uncomfortable situation that Israel is in right now. And there have been times in my life that I have felt like Israel in this situation. There have been times in my life where I have felt like God has brought me to an impossible situation. How could this possibly be better than where I was before? At least I knew what kind of suffering I was doing before. God's led me out into this weird space, this wilderness space, without a destination in my mind, without a destination that I'm privy to. And he's put me in this circumstance or situation where all I have is to cry out to him. All I have is to ask my spiritual leader, what are you doing? Why have you brought me here? I can relate to what Israel's feeling in this moment. What I didn't know maybe at that time is that God was protecting me. God had put that buffer between me and my old life, me and the thing that wants to take me captive. God had settled between me and that captor. And God was making a way through other people in my life, through people that were leading me, to make a solid ground for me to find my path to what was next. And that's beautiful. And that's what this text is showing me here, is that God is going to put certain situations and circumstances in my life when I'm going through a transition of being broken free from an old way of life, where he's going to test my faith. He's going to continue to take care of me. He's going to continue to protect me, but it's going to be scary. It's going to be dark. There's going to be things that I don't know the answer to. And sometimes my spiritual leaders are going to get the message not exactly right either, but there's going to be truth to what they say, because we can trust our spiritual leaders. Because if you've gone through the process of getting to know your spiritual leader, getting to know how they know God, you can trust them. They may not always get it perfectly right, or they may forget a detail here or there, but you can trust your spiritual leaders because they've been given to you by God. Also wanted to say that, so that was a part of the text that I didn't know, was that there was this cloud that had descended, and that it actually took some time for the sea to be parted, because in all of the movies and everything that I've ever seen that visually depict this scene, it's been a pretty quick turnaround between Moses waving his hand and the sea parting. It's actually a little bit of time. So after that, we learned that Israel walks through the sea on dry ground. The author and the text are very purposeful in repeating this a couple times in this chapter of the book, that the Israelites, and actually in the next chapter as well, the Israelites walked through in dry ground. The Egyptians, on the other hand, walk through, and it says that their chariot wheels get stuck, that they start to have a hard time getting through, suggesting that God slows down the enemy. God has certain things in place, has certain circumstances in place and situations in place to slow down our enemies, to give us time to walk the path, the solid ground that he set out for us. So I thought that was very interesting as well. And then, so some of the questions that I have are, I'll start with a statement. Israel walked into the sea because God told them to. Moses told them to stay still. God told them to walk through. When humans saw the circumstances, they saw that only when humans saw the circumstances, they saw that only God could get them out of. God demanded that they participate in their freedom. God demanded that Moses, as their leader, participate and that the Israelites participate by taking the steps forward with incredible fear on all sides of them. They had the fear of the water on the left, on the right. They had their enemies behind them. They had an unknown future ahead of them. The people of Israel had to have faith and to walk in through those waters, to walk into those waters and through those waters. God provided a perfect path for them. Again, the contrast between their solid, dry ground and the Egyptians and their wheels getting clogged and their wheels getting stuck. God provided a perfect path for Israel. Scary circumstances, but perfect path. The questions I have for you there are, where am I like Israel? Where have I been in a tough spot in my life? And I mentioned I've been in a couple, but where have I been in a tough spot in my life where I felt my spiritual leaders or I felt God wasn't with me, that they didn't have my best interest in mind, or they didn't know what was best for me, or that God simply couldn't do what I needed God to do? When in those circumstances did I find my old life running after me to come and get me? My addictions, my bad behaviors, my doubt and my fear running to take me captive again, to sit in that fear and to keep me there. Where is God asking me to participate in my salvation in that situation? What acts of faith is God asking me for in those situations? How can I be more trusting of God when I have all of these circumstances around me telling me that this is not a good situation for me? How can I still have faith? I can have faith because I can rely on the Bible to teach me stories like this that show that God is in between me and the enemy, that God has made me a perfect path, that God has given me a leader, that God has given me a way to go forward. When others say, stay still, I go with God. I can learn these things when I read the Bible, when I look at it, when I take a good close look at it and I read the Bible. When I find myself today in circumstances, I can say, but I know a faithful God because I trust the Bible and I trust what God has written in his word. I trust the stories that he's recorded for us. For us to call to mind in our current circumstances to say, but that God of the Bible is still the same God of today. And he has a perfect path laid out for me. He will slow down my enemies, he will protect me, and he will swallow my enemies as the Egyptians were swallowed by the Red Sea. Also, I want to talk about Egypt. Egypt walked into the sea with self-interest in mind. They left the comfort of their own country to cause harm and suffering to another group of people. Egypt seemed to suffer from really short-term memory. They had had a long season of suffering at the hand of poor decision-making from their spiritual leader and not fully embracing the consequences that the God of Israel was laying out on them for not obeying his request to let his people go. They just kicked Israel out of their land and did as God said, obeyed God. And now they were turning on that. And they were saying, no, we want Israel back. They were stuck in their old way of doing things. And they were relying on human power to fulfill their desires. They wanted to break the backs of the Israelites to fulfill their desires of building and making things bigger and stronger and building up their own pride, their own ego, to show that they were the biggest country, to show that they had the biggest and best. That wasn't God's plan. When have I found myself acting like the Egyptians? When have I found myself chasing after something that I know is not mine, that I know is not for me, ignoring all of the signs, ignoring God slowing me down in the process, ignoring God putting a barrier between me and the thing that I want? When have I blatantly ignored that? And when have I experienced death because of it? Obviously, I didn't die when I found myself in those circumstances, but parts of me had to die. Relationships had to die. Unfortunately, pain is suffered when I ignore what God is telling me to do, what God has commanded me to do. If you find yourself in those situations today where you're ignoring circumstances that God has put you in, if this is speaking to you and you find yourself in a circumstance that you know that you shouldn't be a part of, cry out to God. There were Egyptians with the Israelites walking on that dry ground. The text doesn't say that specifically, but the text does say that when they left Egypt, they left with a mixed multitude of people. And what most assume that means is that some of the people who once ignored God and didn't listen to God and disobeyed God, they turned and they said, but this God of Israel has something to offer. Look at the power of this God of Israel. Look at what he's offering his people. Look at how he protects his people. That's the God that I want to serve. So if you find yourself today in a situation that you know you shouldn't be in, or if you find yourself in a situation where it seems like your circumstances are impossible, cry out to God and ask him to show you. Ask him where he wants you to go. Have an intimate relationship with God. Thank you so much for spending time with me. I'll be back with chapter 15 in our next video.